Greetings, CLIA Global Membership Community, and welcome to the CLIA COVID-19 update. I am Stephanie McDowell. You guys may or may not know me, which is great. Either way, you're learning me today. And our two experts that you're going to learn from today are Brian Salerno. He is our Senior VP of Maritime Policy here at CLIA, and Dr. Joyce Johnson. She is a physician and professor of epidemiology or a consultant on emerging infectious medical school. There you go, professor in medical school. All right, so these are your amazing professionals who are going to do that you need to conduct your business and provide well-informed service to your clients. So our agenda today, we're going to start with an overview of CLIA cruise line policies, today's statistics, history of COVID-19 epidemiology and clinical characteristics, and then we'll follow up with what's next and your questions. Now, before we continue, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. In the handout section of your webinar dashboard is a document providing you with the COVID-19 messaging and talking points. Please feel free to download it and keep it handy. Questions that you may have may already be answered by this document. Regarding our North America individual agent members, this document or the information therein will also be in your My Marketing panel within your My CLIA dashboard. FYI, all attendees are muted. Though the raise your hand feature is available, we will not be utilizing this function today. If you have a question, please type it accordingly in your question field. I will be answering some of these questions throughout. However, many of them we will hold to the end for the Q&A section with our experts. Finally, I want to encourage you to consider what resources on this topic that you believe may be helpful for you in the future. If you think of something, let us know in the question section, okay? Without further ado, I'm going to hand over control, if you will, to Brian Salerno.
Thank you, Stephanie, and hello to everybody on the line. This is Brian Salerno speaking, and what I would like to do in the next few minutes is bring you up to speed on the measures that we've put in place to reduce the risk of this virus affecting cruise operations. And I'll start by saying that our industry has a lot of experience managing global public health emergencies. Much like the rest of the travel industry, we've had to adjust our procedures during past emergencies to protect our customers, and that's always our top priority, protecting our customers and our passengers. That's the prerequisite for allowing our operations to continue. Our ability to respond quickly to this emergency was predicated in large measure on steps that we have practiced before. So within 24 hours of the World Health Organization issuing its declaration that this strain of coronavirus, which is now designated COVID-19, represented a public health emergency with international effects, the cruise industry established its own enhanced screening measures. These measures were recommended by our medical working group, which is a group within CLIA that is comprised of the senior medical officers from our various member cruise lines. These recommendations were in turn approved by cruise line CEOs in what we call the Global Executive Committee. And at that point, once the CEOs approved them, they became the standard policy across all of our member cruise lines. So that encompasses 272 ocean-going cruise ships. So this does not preclude individual cruise lines from doing more, but it established a consistent baseline throughout the industry. So I'll describe those measures in a moment, but I would ask you to keep in mind that COVID-19 is a continually evolving situation. So the specific measures that I will describe could very well change as the medical working group considers new information. In fact, the initial screening measures, which went into effect the day after the WHO declaration, have already been strengthened once, and that occurred about a week after them being into effect. And I would anticipate that we'll see further strengthening in the coming days. Also, as we considered the current measures, I'll point out that we also took into account that many cruise passengers will have passed through one or more screening portals en route to their ship, particularly if they've crossed international borders in their travels. This doesn't replace our measures, but it does augment them to some extent. So this is something, too, that we will continue to evaluate as the situation becomes more fluid. So here are the specific screening measures. Next slide, please. There we go. Here's the specific screening measures, and you can see there are essentially three components. They involve travel history, contact, and symptoms, and I'll just walk you through those very quickly. Travel history involves a declaration by individual passengers or families traveling together as to whether they have been in or transited through China, Hong Kong, or Macau within 14 days prior to their intended embarkation. If that is the case, then they would be denied boarding. And the reason for the 14 days is that that is the assumed incubation period for the COVID-19 virus. Contact. This refers to a passenger who may have had close contact with someone who has been diagnosed or suspected of or subject to monitoring for the COVID-19 virus. Passengers who report having this contact, again, within 14 days prior to embarkation, they would also be denied boarding. And then the third bucket here is symptoms. Passengers are asked if they are currently experiencing symptoms consistent with the COVID-19 virus, and these include such things as fever, coughing, difficulty breathing, and Dr. Johnson might fill us in on a little bit more on that in a few minutes. So if somebody is showing these symptoms, they would be asked to undergo a more detailed screening by the onboard medical team before a boarding decision is made. Now, not all persons would necessarily be denied boarding based on symptoms alone if the medical staff concludes that they are not related to COVID-19. But as per normal practice, they may be asked to confine themselves to their stateroom until they're no longer deemed contagious. Next slide, please. Now, so far, the measures appear to have been effective. Of the 272 ships in the CLIA-associated fleet, only one has had confirmed cases of coronavirus on board. And that, of course, was the ship in Japan that attracted so much media attention. It's worth pointing out that that particular voyage commenced about a week prior to the WHO announcement and the subsequent establishment of our enhanced screening measures. So timing in that case was extremely unfortunate. The primary effects, of course, have been in the Asia market. However, the screening measures are in effect worldwide. We're engaged in a global risk management effort as it pertains to our ships and monitoring closely the advice of the WHO, Center for Disease Control in the United States, and other regional health authorities. Even so, we're not taking anything for granted, especially as this virus spreads globally. And that is why you will likely see more stringent screening measures in the coming days. And I would encourage you to monitor the CLIA website for updates in this regard. Now, although some passengers may be denied boarding, and we certainly deeply regret that it must be so, it is essential to do that to protect the safety and the health of other passengers. And that remains our top priority, not only in this emergency, but every day that we operate. And one additional thing that I would like to underscore, and I think it's an important bit of information for travel agents, is that every CLIA-associated cruise ship has a medical facility on board and a trained medical staff. These facilities and staff members must meet the guidelines of the American College of Emergency Physicians, also known as ACEP, and it's the largest, most influential emergency medicine association in the world. It's a CLIA policy. They follow those guidelines, and in fact, it is a condition of membership CLIA. Our member lines are required to follow that. Cruise ships are unique as a vacation option in that our passengers travel with a hospital and a doctor, which should offer some reassurance as we work through this global health emergency. Next slide, please. And I'll just finish up with this one last slide from me before turning over to Dr. Johnson. This is just a quick look at Asia, a map of Asia showing just from a ship perspective. Overall, we've had about 13 ships affected by the temporary shutdown in the market. Most cruise itineraries have been canceled for the next month or so. Several ships have been repositioned out of the region, and several more are idle, as you can see on this chart. There's actually 2 ships that have been dedicated to humanitarian purposes. One is providing complimentary cruises to firefighters who've been battling fires in Australia, and another is dedicated to complimentary cruises for firefighters and emergency responders dealing with the wildfires in the western U.S. So at least that capacity is being put to some good use. Asia represents about 10% of the cruise market. So this is a lot of capacity that's going unused right now. Fortunately, other markets such as North America, Europe, which are major markets for our industry, have been able to continue operating, albeit with the enhanced screening measures in place. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Johnson, who is uniquely qualified to provide you with an understanding of the nature of this virus. So Dr. Johnson.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I'm happy to be with you this morning and to share some of what is known about the new COVID-19 virus. So I will go into the recent history of the virus, barely 2 months. It's amazing how much we've learned about the virus. Many years ago, I worked at the Centers for Disease Control at the beginning of the HIV/AIDS outbreak. At that time, it took several years to even recognize that the disease was caused by a virus and to identify the virus. Already, at the time the Chinese identified that they had a problem at the end of December, they already had the genomic makeup of the virus. Within 2 months, not only has the genome been sequenced, but the genome virus that's been affecting many patients has also been sequenced, which has been important because it showed that the virus is relatively stable. There are also test kits available worldwide so that the virus can be tested for. Various countries have been able to grow the virus in tissue culture, which is very important in terms of ongoing research. And we've even begun clinical trials with various antiviral drugs in parts of the world. A couple of days ago, a potential vaccine candidate was reported. Public health officials and scientists worldwide have made and are making tremendous progress. As we look at the following data, we should remember this progress. So on this slide, let's talk a little bit about what the numbers actually mean. Worldwide, there have been over 80,000 cases. Of those, about 97% have been in China. There's a calculated case fatality rate of 3.3%. Let's talk a minute about what that really means. That's taking the number of deaths or fatalities and dividing it by the number of cases. That number appears to be much higher than if you look worldwide. We'll talk a bit about this later, but WHO just returned from China, and they found in China the case fatality rate to be about between 2 and 4%. But worldwide, or if you exclude the Chinese cases, it's closer to about 7% or 0.7%, so it's less than 1%. But all of these data, I think, have to be looked at in the context of how they're collected and of all the challenges in getting really accurate data. First, cases of any reportable disease are difficult to recognize and even to identify in the calm of a routine daily life. However, it's infinitely more difficult to accurately identify each and every case when there is a crisis or chaotic situation, as there is in China right now. In an environment stressed by the virus, If an elderly patient has a cough and dies, was it due to COVID-19 or to a heart attack? It can be very difficult to know for sure. Second, many infections are mild or even asymptomatic and can easily go unrecognized. There would be no way to identify them unless everyone in an outbreak area was repeatedly tested, and this is not practical or advisable. The impact on this on the data are that there probably are more cases, but at the same time, the ratio of deaths to cases is probably much lower. So the calculated case fatality rate is most likely higher than the real case fatality rate. Another issue is laboratory testing. Laboratory testing is indicated for many people, and they are tested. Some of these are test positive and are identified as cases. Other people are identified as cases by their clinical presentation. Some of these probably are cases and some are not real cases if you were to do the laboratory testing. So again, that's how these numbers are not perfectly accurate. Also, we need to think about the logistics of information transfer from a patient's home or hospital room to the local health authorities and to the national health authorities, and from there to the World Health Organization. This takes some time. So things are always changing. And as we go through the things that I'm going to talk about, this is what things seem to be today. But as we learn more and more about the virus, we may find other things to be. We may find that some of these assumptions turn out not to actually be true. But the importance of the data is to look at trends over days or weeks and eventually over months to track what is happening. Certainly in new areas where clusters of cases are identified, these data are critical. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. So this is a map of the world, and let's start on the west to kind of move our way east. As we mentioned, there's about 80,000 cases worldwide, and about 97% of those are in China. Outside of China, 33 countries have reported disease and 34 deaths. Those 33 countries have reported 2,400 cases, which, though that's, in terms of human casualty, that's a lot. But relative to the number in China, it's really not that many. In the Americas, 63 cases have been recognized, 10 in Canada, and 53 in the U.S. Currently, no cases have been reported from Central or South America or Mexico. In Europe, 279 cases have been reported, the large circle there representing Italy. Italy has reported 229 cases, but the part that's notable about that is just over 100 of those are new cases, which suggests that the number of cases in Italy may continue to escalate. Most of those cases are in several communities in northern Italy. The working assumption is that those cases probably were infected by one or more people a couple of weeks or so ago, who were asymptomatic and were not recognized. But there is a very intensive investigation going on by the World Health Organization in coordination with the Italian government to try to learn more about those. Some of the other red spots in Europe: Germany has 16 cases, France 12, and the UK 13. 6 other countries have 1 or 2 cases. Moving over to the Eastern Mediterranean, there's 98 total cases, the majority of which, 61, are in Iran. There's 13 in the United Arab Emirates and 8 each in Bahrain and Kuwait. And there's a couple of other cases, 1 or 2 cases each in 5 other countries. In Southeast Asia, most of the cases are in Thailand. The number of new cases in Thailand, there was 37 cases in Thailand. There are only 2 new cases, so that suggests that in Thailand things may be stabilizing off some, but again, that's very difficult to really predict. India has 3 cases, and there's 1 each in Nepal and Sri Lanka. If we continue moving east to the Western Pacific region, the Republic of Korea has 977 cases, which is one of the large circles in that region. 214 of those are new. I think, the media has certainly described the way those cases have been transmitted, and it appears to be, I'll call it a common source. It started out as kind of a common source with a church group that had relatively close contact with members and continued to have meetings after people got sick. Japan has had 157 cases, and Singapore 90. There's 22 each in Australia and Malaysia, 16 in Vietnam. The Vietnamese cases are interesting in that the reports are that all of their people have either been cured or are doing better, and there have been no deaths. 3 in the Philippines and 1 in Cambodia. And then there's also the 691 cases on the international conveyance, is how that's being reported. Next slide. Again, we should remember that the world has only known about this virus for about 2 months. Actually, a little bit less than 2 months. And tremendous progress has been made. What we're going to talk about now is just sort of go through some of the key events that have happened over these last 2 months. It appears that China was first aware of something going on medically back in November. The end of December, they notified WHO of pneumonia cases of unknown cause in Wuhan. At the same time they notified WHO of this, they also provided the genomic sequencing of the virus. In January, I don't think it was that late, but okay, anyway, in January, the Secretary of HHS declared a public health emergency. And shortly thereafter, the World Health Organization declared in China a public health emergency of international concern. Next slide. By February 2nd, some travel recommendations were made. Basically, that U.S. citizens would have a 14-day mandatory quarantine if they had been in Hubei province during the prior 14 days. And also that U.S. citizens would go through proactive entry screening if they had been in mainland China within the 14 days. And at that time, there was 7 ports, airports, allowed entry into the country from mainland China. Other people who were foreign, who were not U.S. citizens or did not have green cards or other immigration reasons to be here, who were physically in China within 14 days, were temporarily suspended from entering the U.S. That was a very, very dramatic decision. The last time that the U.S. had any type of quarantine activity was back in the Spanish flu about 100 years ago. February 7th, the U.S. published an interim final rule, which is normally interim final rules are published to get review and comment, and they're not made implementable at that time. So this one was implemented at the time it was first published in the Federal Register. And it requires airlines to collect names, addresses, emails, and 2 phone numbers on all airline passengers and to electronically transmit that data to CDC. That's a rather massive undertaking, and it's in process right now. But the reason for that is so that should there be any cases linked potentially to airlines, that a full case investigation can be done. Next slide. On February 11th, WHO named the coronavirus COVID-19. So that's the virus. That's the name that you'll usually be hearing about it now. Yesterday, WHO completed site visits to China, including Wuhan, and what they reported back is that they found that the disease peaked in China sometime between January 23rd and February 2nd. They also noted that the DNA of the virus has remained stable, which is very good news because, one, that makes it easier to develop a vaccine, and it also becomes easier to monitor and take care of patients if the genome is stable. Again, as I mentioned earlier, they found that the fatality rate in China is between 2 and 4%, but that it's less than 1% in other places. In terms of the disease and the clinical presentation, they found that mild disease generally resolved in about 2 weeks, and severe disease resolved in about 3 to 6 weeks. So as of today, there's 2 countries that are in a watch level 3, which is to avoid non-essential travel. That's China and South Korea. And that's primarily because of the extent of community transmission in those 2 countries. Watch level 2, practice enhanced precautions, Japan, Iran, and Italy. And the reason for those 3 countries is primarily because there is some there's some community spread in those countries. In Italy, it's certainly in a fairly isolated region. And watch level 1, practicing the usual precautions, is Hong Kong. Next. So what does the disease look like? Brian mentioned a little bit that the primary symptoms are fever, cough, and shortness of breath. I mentioned that, however, many patients, or at least some patients, seem to be asymptomatic and they have no symptoms at all. The disease, like many diseases, has a full range of clinical presentations, from very minor to very severe. More severe cases tend to have pneumonia and organ failure, especially renal failure. And then, as we mentioned, excluding China, less than 1% can result in death. How is the disease transmitted? It seems to be transmitted with close personal contact with an infected person within about 6 feet. Coughing and sneezing, because of the moist droplets, transmits disease. Masks are recommended for patients, people who could be shedding virus, not for routine people. It's certainly in the United States and in Europe, with a possible exception of parts of Italy. There would be no reason for a healthy person to wear a mask in their usual day-to-day activities. There's studies going on now to determine how long the virus may live on tabletops and other surfaces. Right now, it's suggested that you be careful and not touch your eyes and mouth, which are mucous membrane areas, after touching other surfaces that could be infected with virus. I think that the most important thing to keep in mind when we're talking about transmission of a disease is that transmission of any infectious disease really requires 3 things. It requires the virus or the infectious organism, a route of transmission, and a host which is someone to get sick. If the virus isn't there, there is no way to get infected with the virus. So, for example, I live in Washington, D.C., and the virus isn't here. I'm not going to get sick with this virus no matter what I do in Washington, D.C., because the virus isn't here. So I have no reason to wear a mask when I go out and about doing my daily routines. I have no reason to fear going on a crowded metro, which is how I got here this morning. The only time there can be an infection is if the virus is there. And I think one of the reasons why the CLIA recommendations for preventing illness on cruise ships has been so effective is because of the recognition of that very fact. As long as it's been shown that the recommendations were followed and people with the disease did not go on the ships and people on the ships did not get sick. With, the one case, the one ship that did have disease, was before the recommendations existed. The incubation period of 2 to 14 days. That incubation period was established really at the very beginning of this, and it was based on MERS and SARS and related viruses. Certainly, even if you have even with an established disease, and you have to say the incubation period, that's the timeline in which most cases happen. So if you read something that says, oh, somebody got sick 19 days after, somebody got sick, 1 day after, that would not be a real surprise, because that incubation period is what maybe 99% or some percentage of patients get sick during. And in this case, those days were actually based on related viruses, not specifically on this virus. We can look just briefly at the picture of the person. I think it shows that there's systemic effects, fever and fatigue, a number of respiratory signs, and that makes it very confusing, because most of those respiratory signs go along with either a common cold or with influenza. One of the best things to do right now is make sure that you get your influenza vaccines. That's going to really simplify any kind of confusion of this virus with influenza. And then we talked about the renal function. Some patients get diarrhea. With MERS, diarrhea is a more common, has been a common situation as well. Okay, next slide. Okay, testing. It's really been remarkable that testing for this virus and for this disease has been developed as quickly as it has. All of the test kits are not formally FDA approved. FDA is allowing their use in sort of an emergent situation, and as a result of that, the tests are only done by the Centers for Disease Control and state and local health departments that they authorize and that they make sure are testing correctly. The samples are usually taken usually you try to get all of the following samples. Upper respiratory tract specimen, which is basically taking a swab and pretty aggressively trying to get a specimen from the nasopharyngeal area, which is basically around the nose and also at the back of the throat. And then also to try to get sputum. If the person can cough up some sputum and phlegm, that's also another good source of trying to test for the virus. CDC and many governments in the world are doing testing, and the state health departments some state health departments have just begun testing in the last 2 days, but more are continuing to bring it on board. And again, there's no reason to do routine testing for people that are not in areas where there's risk. Okay, treatment and prevention. Treatment is basically supportive care, managing the symptoms. There have been certainly a lot of anecdotal reports of different drugs being used. China has a clinical trial of antivirals, and I believe there's some clinical trials that are being considered in the United States. How infectious is it? I think we're still learning that. It appears that people can be infected by by persons who are asymptomatic with disease. Prevention. Basically, it's similar to preventing other respiratory infections. At this time, we don't have a vaccine, so it's very important to protect yourself from viral exposure if you're in an area where there is someone who is sick with the virus. Again, if you're in an area where no one is sick with the virus and the virus isn't there, there's no way that you can get sick with the virus. But wash your hands. These are good to prevent the flu and other respiratory diseases as well. Wash your hands, cover your cough and sneeze with a tissue. If you don't have a tissue, take your upper arm and put your upper arm in front of your nose and sneeze into your upper arm. I'm continually telling my husband to do that. So that's one of my nagging things, but it's really important that you cover your coughs and sneezes. Again, don't touch your eyes, nose, or mouth. There's bacteria all around you and viruses as well. They can infect you through the mucous membranes. Avoid close contact with sick people. Clean high-touch surfaces, and cruise ships are very, very good about keeping high-touch surfaces cleaned. They have probably the most effective and aggressive approach to cleaning services as any place does. And stay home when you're sick, and that's so that you don't expose other people. Okay. Okay, this is an initial assessment. I'm just going to I won't really go through that at this point. But basically what this shows is that the only people, this was a sort of a chart for physicians to look at when they were doing an initial assessment of patients, but I don't think we don't need to go through that. Okay, and so what do we expect next? I think most importantly is that the world is responding to this virus and countries are doing their best to prevent its spread. Many countries are now contributing financially to the World Health Organization, as well as funding research independently. And not only are they funding research, but they're also putting a lot of effort into emergency preparedness and management. There's an emphasis trying to identify vaccines. However, in reality, a vaccine will probably take a couple of years before there's certainly a licensed approved vaccine. They are starting to do some vaccine trials on early candidate vaccines at NIH. The very early phase 1 trials, which is just in healthy people, just to see what the effects of the vaccine are, or potential vaccine are. There's also a lot of, I'll call them experiments, with novel treatment regimens and clinical trials with antivirals. Someone suggested chloroquine. I think we're trying to take the knowledge that we have now in treating other viral diseases and other diseases that might have some similarities and take those concepts and see how we can better treat this disease. But again, at the present time, the primary treatment is supportive care. I think to be realistic, that we should anticipate that there'll be an increasing number of cases and perhaps an increasing number, and there also may be new clusters of cases in other parts of the world. And that other parts of the world could include the US or other parts of Europe. It's probably most likely that other countries will also continue to experience community transmission. What community transmission is transmission from person to person where there isn't a direct link to China or a direct link to another known source. But the good news is, as we're able to learn more about the disease, we should be better able to control and manage it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson and Brian, for providing this very critical information to our travel trade membership community. I'm pretty sure that they'll be able to use this and really be able to provide great insight and information to their client base. So now what we are going to do is actually go through some of the questions that we've received during the entire presentation. And a number of them are similar, so I'm going to try to combine as many as I can. There is a question regarding river cruise lines with CLIA and whether or not they also have the medical staff as ocean going.
This is Brian. Our policies are directed towards the ocean-going cruise line, so we do not have the same requirement for river cruises. I am not aware of them having a medical facility on board or a doctor. I mean, they tend to be smaller vessels with fewer people, so I'm not aware of that being the case. Naturally, in a river cruise, they tend to come under the jurisdiction of the local health authorities. You know, whether if they're operating in the U.S., obviously state health authorities would have a lot of influence over how those operations are run. Within Europe, obviously individual countries may also exercise the same level of oversight over the public health conditions on board individual river cruise ships.
Wonderful. And then I'm going to just make the recommendation, as I've answered a number of your questions very specific to cruise lines. I'm going to encourage you to reach directly to your BDM with the specific cruise line to find out exactly what that specific cruise line is doing. While CLIA has general information about what we're requiring of our cruise line members, et cetera, each cruise line may add additional requirements on top of that. So if you want that very specific information, even with the river cruises, please reach out to your BDM to find out that information. Brian, can you once again go over for our attendees the number of CLIA cruise line ships that has an affected or have had a case of coronavirus?
Yep, absolutely. One ship out of 272 in the CLIA associated fleet has had confirmed cases of coronavirus, and that was the ship in Japan. There have been other ships where people have raised concerns, but they have all proved to be negative. People did not have the coronavirus. So it's just one ship out of 272 so far. And certainly our goal working with our member lines is to prevent the introduction of this virus on any other ships to the maximum extent possible.
And this is Dr. Johnson, and to sort of reiterate that, is it because some of the early symptoms of coronavirus look like the flu and other common respiratory diseases, it's not surprising that someone might wonder whether a particular person has coronavirus and then for it to test negative and to just turn out to be sort of a routine respiratory infection.
Okay, so that's great to hear because a number of our attendees have asked questions about what they've heard on other cruise lines. So folks, you've heard it here today, literally one ship, okay?
And let's remember that one ship happened before the recommendations.
Yes, and I actually added that key point. I sent a message to our attendees with that key point once you made it, Dr. Johnson. Another question, because we also have destination partners, and also received a message or a question from a destination partner I think is actually attending, and they're asking more or less, what can a port destination do on our end to strengthen or complement the precautionary policies in place by the authorities in the cruise industry?
I think one of the things would be to really encourage any passengers that do have the cold or the flu or any symptoms or are sick to be honest about reporting that as they would begin their travels.
Yeah. And I would just say for any destination, just like throughout the cruise industry, paying close attention to the guidance and advice of the World Health Organization and the CDC and local health authorities. They're watching this very closely, as are we, and instituting whatever measures that can be realistically done at portals where people have to congregate and be processed to get on a cruise or in any transportation node would be a good practice if they follow those guidelines.
Sure, absolutely agreed. We've had a number of folks ask questions regarding air, et cetera, and they have concerns that the air isn't following it, more or less the policies that CLIA has put in place for our member lines. I've definitely directed them to, of course, make some noise in the air travel industry if this is something of great concern. But Dr. Johnson, I did have a couple of medical related questions. One of them is there a symptom that obviously stands out that from the flu to corona?
Unfortunately, there really isn't, and that's one of the things that makes this so very, very difficult. And so that's one of the reasons why when people are trying to determine who should be tested, it's not so much based on the symptoms, but rather it's based on the history.
Another question, and it goes back to where you were sharing the calculated case fatality rate. The question is it likely higher given the asymptomatic cases?
Actually, the more asymptomatic cases you have, the lower the case fatality rate becomes. Because the case fatality rate is the number of fatalities over the number of cases, with the number of cases being the denominator. So the larger that the denominator gets, the lower the case fatality rate is.
Wonderful. That's good news to me, if no one else.
I think that's very good news. And I think also as we learn more about the disease, that the case fatality rate will also continue to drop.
Absolutely. Speaking of passengers that are asymptomatic, truly we don't know if someone is getting on with it Is that correct? So, for example, if someone is asymptomatic, they have not been to these locations, but then...
There is that possibility. If they haven't been to those locations and they have no symptoms, it's possible. But that's the value of having a medical team on board. You know, if symptoms do manifest themselves during the course of a voyage, we would encourage them to, very, very quickly contact the medical staff on board and get an evaluation as to whether or not they would need to be isolated.
Another question, and I'm sure that this definitely touches on some points that you made, Brian, about local health requirements, if you will. Do we expect the virus will be contained in northern Italy, or is there concern that it will spread to Rome?
I don't know that I'm qualified to answer that question, but Dr. Johnson.
I don't think anyone knows the answer to that. I have not seen anything from WHO that identifies Rome as an area of concern. I think WHO and the Italian government are both dealing with this very, very aggressively, and that's the reason why they're there right now, trying to understand exactly what the epidemiology is in those regions and then to be able to contain it there.
Sure. Any idea of when a vaccine could possibly be ready?
A vaccine. So let's talk a minute about what you have to do to make a vaccine. First, you have to know the virus, which that we do. Then there's different kinds of sort of general approaches, but an important thing with the vaccine is that the vaccine has to cause the person to make antibodies, but not just any antibodies. The antibodies actually have to be protective against the disease. And that's the part that can be a really difficult challenge. Even if we had that, it also has to go through the full at least some part of the full regulatory process. There may be emergency approvals and things like that. But I would say the closest would be well over a year.
Okay.
I think that it's really important that we put a lot of emphasis on trying to contain the disease as best we can and not waiting for a vaccine, because I think that's it's going to be a long time.
Sure. Okay, I am actually double checking a number of questions. Again, I'm just trying to group as many together as possible because we have a very, very attentive and active audience on our hands. Can you comment on cleaning and disinfection procedures? Anything that you recommend outside of what CLIA is recommending, et cetera?
It says a general statement. There is a ongoing procedure on our memberships for cleaning and disinfection. I mean, that's routine. Naturally, with this virus, the level of emphasis and concern has been ramped up. If you were on a cruise ship, even under normal circumstances, you would encounter frequent stations for hand sanitizers, crew members walking around offering to give you a little spray of a hand sanitizer. Yeah, exactly, washy-washy. So this is an ongoing procedure on the ships. And then, with this virus, added emphasis on cleaning surfaces and so forth are fairly common throughout the fleet, just to prevent any further likelihood of anyone being infected. So it's a multi-layered approach, to preventing infection.
Sure. So I'm looking at a number of the other questions, and I believe, for the most part, if we've not addressed them here, they are addressed at cruising.org. So I would encourage everyone listening to definitely visit cruising.org and all of the amazing information and research available there for you. For our CLIA individual agent members in North America, there are a number of things within your My CLIA that you can access. And for those of you joining us outside of North America, I'm sure that there's additional information that we can provide to you. And again, it's available at cruising.org. That said, Brian, Dr. Johnson, any last words?
No, I'd just like to thank everybody for their participation today and encourage you to continue to check our website for updates.
And I just want to say thank you very much for your interest in the topic. I think it's very important that we all stay abreast of what's going on around us.
Absolutely. Well, again, I want to thank Dr. Johnson and thank Brian for taking the time out this morning to really touch base with our community. And as always, we appreciate you taking the time to learn more information to be the best cruise travel selling professionals that you can be. Thank you again for being a part of CLIA's global community. Have an amazing day.